Heading back to the fall sports, football namely, also soccer. So parents, a lot of concerns about concussions and how to spot one. We have some help this morning from Dr. Andy Barnett, the medical director for Legacy Go Health. Dr. Barnett, thanks so much for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
You hear so much about this now. Currently, concussions are definitely in the news about how serious they can be and the lasting, problems that come from them. So as a parent, what's the first thing you do?
Well, if you believe that your junior athlete may have had a concussion, that means that they have to have hit their head in some way. It could be contact in a football event where they strike their head against something. It could be getting hit hard with a ball playing soccer. But there has to be either some impact to the head or the head has to be shaken violently.
Even on the playground, I mean, these can happen.
Absolutely.
A child takes a serious fall.
Yep.
So what are the signs? A child stands up, I have a headache, or they seem, disoriented. Are those the classic signs?
Yes. So typically there has to be that moment of feeling like you had your bell rung, kind of that moment where you feel shaken, and then following that, very typical symptoms would include a headache, an altered level of consciousness, feeling dizzy or nauseated, sometimes even vomiting, and there can be a brief loss of consciousness. We think of concussions as a mild traumatic brain injury, kind of like a brain bruise. But for it to be a concussion, it should be mild, and therefore all of those symptoms should be mild. If there's any loss of consciousness, it should be really brief. And the headache, nausea, vomiting symptoms, none of those should be severe, or they need to seek emergent medical attention.
Well, the thing is, what can you do about a concussion once you get it? There isn't much, is there?
There's not a whole lot, although the emerging science around this, and there is a lot of work being done, especially around what we're learning with former NFL players, is that brain rest is really important. And that means not doing anything that's overly strenuous academically, not doing anything that's overly strenuous physically either. It's absolutely crucial after a concussion that a player not return to sports until they've been cleared by a healthcare professional.
And I've heard, young people who get them of having to avoid light, and having to, give up schoolwork for a time until they do give the brain the rest. I've always heard, don't let your child go to sleep after you feel they've had their bell rung.
Yeah, I've heard that too.
Is that correct?
There's actually not a lot of evidence to show that is one of those, there's probably not a lot of fact behind it. And so it's okay to let kids sleep, but if their symptoms are moderate or severe, they should be evaluated by a healthcare professional before the next day comes around.
How long can you expect the effects of a concussion to linger?
Yeah, average is about 7 to 10 days. So all those symptoms that we described and the limitation from activities, you should start thinking right off the bat this is going to be 7 to 10 days. But the symptoms in some cases can go on for months and months. 3 to 6 months is not at all unheard of.
And you hear about the threat of repeated concussion and damage.
Yeah, really important. We recognize that going back to sports prior to a complete recovery, and that means no symptoms whatsoever. There are laws in the state of Oregon that recognize the importance of this. Here it's known as Max's Law, and it's been around since 2009 because of the devastating consequences of the second hit phenomenon or second impact syndrome. That's what happens if you have another head injury prior to recovering from your first concussion. So really crucial and actually protected by law that kids cannot go back to sporting activities where they might have another head injury prior to a complete recovery.
Sometimes kids don't want to tell you, though.
Yeah.
Because they don't want to be taken
Absolutely.
out.
Does that law require a doctor's clearance for that student to return to sports?
It does. Coaches cannot let a player return to sporting activities until they've been cleared by a healthcare professional.
Good information today, Dr. Barnett. A lot of questions
Very
I
timely,
wondered about.
right?
Yes.
Very timely.
Thanks so much for coming in.
Thanks for
Appreciate
having
it.
me. Appreciate it.